Good morning and welcome to Branson Legacy Sabbath School. We have another very interesting presentation and conversation ahead of us with John Jones. And McKinley is going to lead us in reading, prayer, and introduction. Thank you, McKinley.
Thank you, Simona. This week we lost our brother, Dr. Jeff Carroll. Our condolences to Donna, Jeff's wife. Both have been longtime members of the RBLSS class. Just 3 weeks ago, we were looking forward to enjoying an in-person group potluck hosted by Donna and Jeff. I didn't know Jeff as long as some of you, but what little interaction I had with him showed him to be a man always willing to help. He didn't speak up much during our class discussions, but I remembered when we once were discussing a presentation about the Sabbath, he spoke up. And from that, I got to learn that Jeff was very passionate about the Sabbath. At a time like this, we take comfort in one of the differentiating tenets of our faith, which is particularly relevant as we study faith traditions through the insightful presentations by Dr. John Jones. The comfort of our Lord, the faith of Jesus, and the hope of the resurrection. Our scripture reading will be taken from 1 Corinthians 15, and I'd like to read verses 39 through 58. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is of another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, another glory of the stars. For star differs from star in glory. So is it with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. Thus it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. But it is not the spiritual that is first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second man is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Just as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. I tell you this, brothers and sisters, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up or defeated in victory. O death, where is your victory? O grave, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my beloved brothers and sisters, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. Let's pray. Heavenly Father and our Creator, we praise you this morning for the gift of life, the blessing of prayer, the comfort of hope in Jesus. Comfort us in our time of loss. Comfort Donna and her family. Comfort Jeff's family and friends. We thank you for Jeff's life. Forgive our sins. Strengthen our faith. Grant us your peace. Endow us with your grace. We're grateful for Dr. John Jones and Sister Jones as they bless us today. Let us be aware of your presence as we study and fellowship this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Our speaker today is Dr. John Jones. He served for many years as a professor and dean of the H.S. Richards Divinity School. He also served at 2 Adventist universities in Asia and at Loma University. We're grateful to have John as Distinguished Professor of Biblical and Phenomenological Studies at the Roy Branson Sabbath School. Today, he will build on his masterful presentation on the axial age by exploring 4 spiritual truths and weaving into a single tapestry 4 spiritual threads, learning styles, personality types, the New Testament Gospels, and 4 of Hinduism's yogas. John, we are grateful to have you today.
Well, thank you very much. I know that those words of comfort have been especially meaningful to all of us this morning, and I appreciate it. Well, that's quite an assignment, isn't it? I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say on all of this, but we'll try to be efficient about it as much as we can. And we may this time need to take nearly full advantage of the first hour just to get through some of this material. But again, a good morning and happy Sabbath to everyone. It's an honor always to be invited and a pleasure to have this time with each of you. As some of you will recall, we started a couple of weeks ago to think about a period of time that was a particularly interesting turning point in human experience, called the axial age, dating back to 2,500 years ago and following, in which a number of important new directions emerged across a variety of cultures, but within roughly the same 300, 400 years of one another. Now, that time that we spent together a couple Sabbaths ago kind of lays the foundation for a particular piece of that history that we take up now this morning. A look at one of the numerous writings that date from that period, and a chance to follow that textual material and see what we can learn from it. So with that in mind, first of all, let me ask, how's the audio coming through? Is that okay? Okay.
Yes, everything is okay.
Good. All right. Thank you. And secondly, if we can do a share screen now, let's see if we can make that happen, and it'll help us to get through it. Yeah, here we go. And let's see. Yeah, so spiritual pathways, an interesting subject. It means a lot of different things to different people. So we'll kind of take it as it comes and see what we can make of it. And I look forward to some conversation with you, particularly in our second time. But even in the meantime, if some particular thing needs help or clarification or something, by all means, don't hesitate to raise a hand, and we'll deal with what we need to in passing as we go here. Yeah, so let's see. Lessons, huh? Lessons from the Bhagavad Gita and the New Testament. It's going to be interesting to see how we can maybe wind these things together and make some progress on this. Let's see if we can advance this. Let's see here. Okay, we'll do it this way. All right. So, some of you may have seen the current issue of the Atlantic Journal. Always has interesting and stimulating materials in it. This one this week had a feature article in it by David Brooks entitled "How America Got Mean." And he gives us a kind of a springboard for the basis of our reflections today. So we'll start with just a brief quotation from him. He begins his article in the current issue by writing, "Over the past 8 years or so, I've been obsessed with two questions. The first is, why have Americans become so sad? And he says, then my second related question is, and why have Americans become so mean?" and then he picks up these threads and says, the story I'm going to tell is about morals. In a healthy society, a web of institutions, families, schools, religious groups, community organizations, workplaces, helps form people into kind and responsible citizens, the kind of people who show up for one another. And then he says, we live in a society that is terrible at moral formation. Moving toward the conclusion of his really interesting but difficult analysis, he goes on to say he proposes several remedies. One of these is that our universities in the United States should adopt, and now I'm quoting from him, a new core curriculum. He goes on and says, more and more colleges and universities are offering courses in what you might call how to live. Many of these courses don't give students a ready-made formula, but they do introduce students to some of the venerated moral traditions. And he mentions Buddhism, Judeo-Christianity. We'll be looking at both of those in a bit today, particularly Hinduism and Judeo-Christianity. And he says also Enlightenment, rationalism, and others. These courses, he says, introduce students to those thinkers who have thought hard on moral problems: Aristotle, Desmond Tutu, Martha Nussbaum, and many others. They hold up diverse exemplars to serve as models of how to live well. They put the big questions of life, he says, firmly on the table. And here's his list of them. What is the ruling passion of your soul? Whom are you responsible to? What are my moral obligations? What will it take for my life to be meaningful? What does it mean to be a good human in today's world? And what are the central issues that we need to engage with concerning new technology and human life. These are on page 75 near the end of his article. With those questions then, we take those questions before us as the starting point of our reflections today. And we'll come back to David Brooks at the end of our time together here this morning. If we're going to compare religious traditions, the level on which we can most legitimately and helpfully make comparisons is not in terms of their theology, their doctrine. Those things are quite different from one another, and they don't represent the things that compare most readily. But for purposes of comparison, we move rather to the phenomenological level, which is a fancy word for simply looking at the things that are comparable, things we can observe, things we can see. They may hold different meanings for different people and different religions, but they do represent a ground of comparison. We, a couple or 3 years ago, we had a Sabbath school presentation or two on phenomenology of religion. So just picking up now to list some of these so we can quickly get ourselves located. These represent things like symbols. Every religion has symbols, and it's interesting to compare them. Rituals and ceremonies, these are enacted symbols, and it's interesting to compare them. Sacred narratives, these are symbolic stories, and it's interesting to compare them, and so forth. And we can go on and add to the list quickly. Many religions have sacred texts, scriptures, sacred time, sacred space, patterns of ethics, concepts of divinity and so forth, values, explanations, transformative efficacy. Trust me, we're not going to do all of that today, I promise. but this is a listing as a way of kind of saying this is the level on which the discourse this morning is taking place. So we're kind of working on this phenomenological level, particularly on the level of spiritual pathways, which are phenomena. They can be compared between different religious traditions. So that's kind of what we're doing today. These are not questions of absolute truth or theology, but just the comparable manifestations. So picking up there, you remember that a couple of weeks ago, we noted that the axial age brought a watershed in terms of spiritual options. Different people can choose different ways of going. One could choose, starting with the axial age. That was new. They had not had this before. But in these Near and Middle Eastern and Far Eastern countries, all the way from Mediterranean world all the way to China, new ways of being religious and of living out one's religious life manifested their presence, took opening opportunities now, which were new. Such ways included in India, the emergence of some new literature called the Upanishads. These were basically written as kind of commentaries or explanations on the Vedas. The ancient Vedic materials in Hindu thought date way back far, like 1,500 years before Christ. But now these newer materials, comparatively newer, dating from about 600, 500 before Christ, called the Upanishads, began to crop up in India, excuse me, as kind of appendices to the Vedic scriptures. And these included all kinds of stuff, hymns, poems, and so forth, particularly stories, popular stories. This was new, a trend of new accessibility to lay people. Stories are meaningful to everybody, but especially to lay people. They and opened up new ways that people who did not belong to the priestly class could somehow still get into and learn something from. These great cycles, then, of narrative poetry include many famous collections of stories, such as the Ramayana or Ramayana, depending whether you're speaking Sanskrit or Hindi. That means Rama's journey. The Mahabharata or the Mahabharata, great India, massive, massive epics. These go on forever and ever, recounting histories of the Indian dynasties with deep moral lessons built in. Built into one of the Mahabharata collections is the one known as the Bhagavad Gita, which means something like the hymn of the divine or the song of the blessed one or the song of the Lord. You can translate it different ways. Some 700 stanzas dating from the first half of the last century before Christ. In other words, actually, the older materials in this date to about 300 or 400 years before Christ, and it apparently had a kind of a cumulative process of getting written, went down to about Christ's time or so. In this, the basic idea is that Krishna, a manifestation of Vishnu, a very important central god among the many hundreds of gods in India, Krishna reveals to Prince Arjuna some of the main principles of the various spiritual disciplines or yogas that are available to humans. Now, Prince Arjuna was a historical figure, an important leader in one of the ruling houses of India about 1,000 years before Christ. And so there is a bit of history in the basic events of this collection. We will not spend much time on that here today. We're more interested in the spiritual disciplines, the yogas that are available to human beings. So picking up on that thread now, just in passing quickly, this is a slide taken from a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the Vedic cultures. Just a quick passing picture of Vishnu, one of the leading divinities, came into being, incarnated in various times and ways, but most importantly, perhaps as Krishna, as Paul Arney writes in an encyclopedia article, he says the Supreme Person Vishnu decided to project himself into the unborn son of Vasudeva and became into being as Krishna. Thus, he was not a wholly supernatural being, but as in Christianity, kind of both man and God simultaneously. So we will get acquainted with Krishna here for a bit here this morning. On the island of Bali, in a park on the edge of the city of Nusa Dua, we see this statue. In the background, the taller one standing is Krishna, and the one in front, down kneeling, is Arjuna. And Krishna explains about his incarnation, how it is that from time to time he manifests himself in the world. And so he says, Prince Arjuna, whenever righteousness falters and chaos threatens to prevail, at just times like that, I take on a human body and I manifest myself on earth in order to protect the good, to destroy the evil, ensure triumph of righteousness in every age I am born. So we are now to understand that this represents one of those moments in history when Krishna looks down from the Tushita heavens up above and says, oh dear, things are going badly down there. They need me. I better check in and see what I can do for those poor people down there, see if I can help them out a little bit. So that's kind of the understanding, the idea here. So picking up the threads now on all of this, we start with the first of four pathways that we'll be looking at today. 4 classic spiritual patterns, we could call them, ways of growing and knowing in religious life, spelled out now as stories, as narrative ideas, so that ordinary lay people who are not of the priestly caste, but of the other castes in India, can also begin to carve out their own religious understandings, their own ways of spiritual life. And so the first example we have before us is the one that's known as Jnana Yoga, and it stands for the idea both of wisdom and of knowledge, understanding and insight. And the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, in its 4th chapter talks, the whole chapter is devoted to this theme. So a couple of quick selections just by way of samples. We could have put in a lot more. I thank you for bearing with me as we have to read textual material on the screen. That's the nature of this presentation this time, which is not very exciting, but we'll make the best we can of it. So stay with us here and we'll pick up some of these themes. So here is Krishna talking to Arjuna, and he says, "Released from greed and fear and anger, absorbed in me and made pure by the practices of wisdom, jnana, many have attained unto my own state of being," he says, a kind of enlightened condition. And so the advice some verses later is to Arjuna, find a wise teacher, honor him, ask him your questions, serve him. Only someone who has seen the truth can guide you on the path to wisdom. Wisdom, get the word again there. This is a consistent theme in this part of the book. At the same time, we have from Jesus that famous invitation in Matthew 11, take up my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke, he says, is easy and my burden is light. Note the word yoke. If you notice that our English word yoke and the Sanskrit word yoga sound alike, there's a reason. There's an etymological relationship between those two words. Our English word yoke traces back to yoga in Hindi and Sanskrit. And so we have here an invitation from Jesus to think about what it is to have different yogas, to take his yoke, to learn from him, and because he's making this offer. And he says, my yoke is Christos. I don't know, Anastasia, how would we translate this as something like what, fitting or suitable or comfortable, maybe, something like that?
Yes, in Greek, zygos is when you have, when they plow the fields and they leave that, I don't know in English what is, to keep the two of them walking together.
Yeah, compatible. Yeah.
It's a heavy iron thing, but in the Greek translation that my zygos is light, is them walking together with me.
Ah, yes. So there's a partnership involved.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Well, it is not an accident that yokes like this one are double, and they're shared. Two oxen or two animals side by side can share the burden a little bit. And when we remember that Jesus' formative years were spent working in his father's workshop, we can begin to get some of a history perhaps behind this. The fact of the matter is that a yoke is as you know, but this is rather outdated knowledge these days. The yoke is what the animal pulls presses upon in order to pull a load from behind. And so the yoke has to be shaped very, very carefully, exactly right, to each individual animal. It is custom made. You cannot very well, mass produce something like that. If it doesn't really distribute the load evenly across the animal's shoulders, the animal will get sores and then cannot work. So it's important to get this right. And I'm sure that Joseph and his family made many yokes, shaping each one to the particular animal that the farmer would bring and say, here's my ox or whatever. I need you to shape this yoke just right so the animal can work by pulling. And we can imagine, I suppose, maybe they had a sign out in front of the workshop. Our yokes fit well, or something like that. I don't know, maybe, huh? But we'll see if we can find some yokes that fit well for us today anyway. So here we are. We think then not only of yokes, but of roads as metaphors for a spiritual experience. And the New Testament road, literal pathway that fits this one, the Jnana Yoga path, is the Emmaus Road. Were not our hearts burning within us? Cleopas and his partner asked themselves. They were, as you remember the story from Luke, dragging their feet as they went from Jerusalem down to Emmaus. When they were joined by this third person, this companion whom they didn't recognize, and the conversation went on some 7.5 miles through a sustained process, detailed revelation and explanation, gradually dawning insight that their old understandings could fall away and could be replaced with new ones. New information here, leading to new ideas and ultimately new faith. This then is a cognitive process. It's a head trip, if you please. Growth in this path comes through extended, arduous study and reflection. It may begin with mere doctrinal assent, but it ripens, it matures through understanding and insight to deeper wisdom, not just knowledge, but deeper wisdom. That's why this way of the mind is a demanding path. It's not easy. Demanding for two reasons. Demanding because of the sincere and committed inquiry that it involves, but also because of the humble openness to the new that it requires. We can observe a couple more points, however. This is not a pathway of mere bookishness. Notice two of its qualities. First of all, this is not some kind of arm's length engagement. It strikes deep into the depths of one's soul. We often think of religion as providing psychological comfort, but to follow this deep spiritual pathway goes beyond comfort. It means venturing beyond the conventional securities, the established truisms, into the quest for deeper truth. So to walk the Emmaus Road then with one's very soul on the line actually is an act of utter courage. This is not a superficial piece of business. Secondly, this kind of spirituality, this Emmaus Road experience, does not keep to itself. It turns around and engages the world. As Peter Richardson notes, the quest for truth and clarity regularly plays out into a drive for social justice, often by educating others and working to reform social structures. So, bottom line here on this first pathway, no religion that has a sense of divine grace about it can fail to acknowledge the life of the mind as a God-given gift. And in this view, the adventures of intellectual inquiry and critical reflection are not some mind games far from being faith's enemy. To the devotees of this path, these quests become the central expression of serious faith. There are too many people in all religions who are afraid to study deeply for fear that it will somehow threaten their faith. But real Emmaus Road kind of religious experience has courage to explore, to learn, to grow, and to replace the old with the new, the Emmaus Road. There's a second one, however, the power of bhakti yoga is the passionate devotion that it directs to and derives from its divine Lord. This is not a matter of convergence with the divine. It's not a matter of merging with God. It builds on the distinction between us humans and God as an absolute other. Now Indian thought and Hinduism has two models, one of separation, difference from God, and one of merging with God. But the Bhakti Yoga builds on the idea of the distinction between the human and divine. So here's a bit of a poem from Sant Tukaram Maharaj, who was born about the year 1600 in our calendar, in Marathi, northwest province of India. This is only one stanza. It goes on much longer, but he says, "Can water quaff itself? Can trees taste the fruit they bear? He who worships God must stand distinct from him. So only shall he know the joyful love of God. For if he say that God and he are one, that joy, that love shall vanish instantly away. Pray no more for utter oneness with God." In fact, people in this branch of Hinduism often use a saying, "I want to taste sugar, I don't want to become sugar." You can see the idea at work here. The point behind all of this, for our purposes, it's important, is that Bhakti Yoga builds upon the intense loving devotion and interaction between us and God, as an expression not of some kind of absolute unity or oneness, but rather of mutual devotion and love. We can find here in the Damascus Road a good example of that, of course, where we have Apostle Paul reporting his experience to Agrippa in Acts 26, "Whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the call, to the vision." That kind of absolute and utter devotion regularly finds expression through the symbolic language of rite, ritual, and ceremony. These operate between devotee and divinity in the vertical axis, up and down. Here we are below, and here's God up above, and it's along that axis of our devotion to God that we find the deep, profound, love is the right word, loving devotion. Once this is established, once that vertical axis is in place, then this profound relationship can also extend outward along the horizontal axis of relationships with other humans, a universal sharing of the divine grace and love across the entire created order. Here's a sample from the Gita that breathes a similar air. The same to both friend and foe, the same in disgrace or honor, suffering or joy, untroubled, indifferent to praise and blame, quiet, filled with devotion, content with whatever happens, at home, wherever he or she is. Yeah, here is Lord Krishna saying that is the kind of person, that's the devotee whom I especially appreciate and love. Yeah, filled with devotion, content with whatever happens. And in the following verse, those who realize the essence of duty, who trust me completely, surrender their lives to me, an act of absolute devotion. I love them with very great love. Isn't that interesting? So here is a model of the intense relationship, not of one being absorbed into the other, but of the interaction between the two, the human and the divine, in that axis of mutual devotion. In this spirit, then, we read that the aging apostle Paul finally arrives in his life at the point of readiness either to die, knowing that he will then see the face of the one who loved him and whom he loved in return, or to go on living for the sake of loving those whom his Lord loved. Similarly, we can compare Mother Teresa, who could pour her life into ministering to abandoned, dying human beings. Each of them is Jesus in disguise, she said. Paul, Teresa, because they loved Jesus, they served others. What we must think of here, then, is a pathway that builds, perhaps first of all, on ritual, on rite, on ceremony. The acts establish the axis, the relationship. But once the ritual has shown us the way, we grow beyond ritual. We move past ceremony into a world where we get real dirt under our fingernails, and we really also reorient or expand, I should say, our devotion to God into devotion to fellow humans as well. So that when Mother Teresa was wiping the blood and dirt off the face of some poor dying old person that she found in the gutter, she would say, "It is as if I was drying the tears and wiping the face and washing the face of Jesus." That was her way of establishing the bond between herself and others. But again, when we see this, notice again, filled with devotion. This is the language that is really important for this particular pathway. There is, however, another pathway called karma yoga. And to Arjuna, Krishna explains the way of the mind that we've looked at already, number one, jnana yoga, and the way of the hand, karma yoga. He compares those two and says, in this world, there really are two main paths. The yoga of understanding for contemplative men or people, and for men or people who are active, the yoga of action. And I just want to clarify, this is not some shallow, busy running around busyness. To the individual who is oriented toward action, however, it does come as a matter of duty, of living out one's essential dharma or nature, as Indian thought has it. And so again, taking from the chapter on karma yoga in the Gita, we read, not by avoiding actions does one gain freedom from action. Not by renunciation alone can one reach the goal. Do any actions that you must do. Any action is better than inaction. Even the existence of your body depends on necessary actions. But that needs unpacking a little further, doesn't it? We need to explore that a bit more. Here we have an example in the New Testament in the well-known experience of the Jericho Road. Thou shalt love. Here on the Jericho Road, the attitude is that is least commendable, least subject to our human will, but it finds its expression in the will to act in accord with love. And so in that acting we grow. Whether we are in the role of caregiver, like the Samaritan, who refuses to accede to the stereotypes imposed upon him as a bad person, or the recipient of such care as exalts humanness as overriding any ethnic, cultural, or socioeconomic resentments, we grow. We burst those barriers. We expand beyond those limitations, even as the Samaritan did. The path of the deed, if you want to call it, the way of the hand, path of the deed, as Dag Hammarskjöld understood, simply speaks for itself. That's especially true today. In our era, he writes, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So that may be the most popular and meaningful pathway for us today. Fellow pilgrims along this way, the way of action, tend to be people who quite naturally wade into the world's problems with sleeves rolled up. They have less of Mother Teresa about them and more of Mahatma Gandhi, whose action was aimed at directly resolving communitarian conflicts or correcting social and societal injustices. And today, such people are to be found volunteering with Doctors Without Borders in Nepal, helping World Health Organization improve the training of skilled birth attendants in Uganda, writing letters of protest on behalf of Amnesty International to leaders, rulers of oppressive regimes, volunteering as teachers in Chad, and the list goes on and on. You can expand that list very well. People associated with Loma Linda know that kind of pathway very well, don't they? As we see here, a picture, a statue of Gandhi and leading people in that pathway. And so this way, sometimes this way gets termed appropriately the way of work. But we need to understand this is not a way of works, like some kind of works righteousness, in the sense of deeds performed to either earn salvation in heaven's regard or to earn esteem in the eyes of our fellow humans. Rather, these actions are done for the sake of the recipient, for the sake of the pilgrim who walks the road. And for both, the payoff comes in the gradual shift of perspective. The more we engage the hardships, the reversals, the sufferings of others, the less our own preoccupations loom in our sight. And self gradually fades then ultimately in proportion to this larger picture. In this way, we can find meaning and spiritual growth by living out exalted principles through our doing in a very mundane world. We act to improve the world, and yet the ultimate point is more to improve ourselves. It's a matter of actualizing our better selves until our ordinary selves grow into that higher mode of being. Pat and I well remember a Caucasian girl from the United States, maybe in her early 20s, maybe 22 or so, whom we met in a death house, actually, on the outskirts of Kathmandu in Nepal. She was volunteering there for a while, up to her elbows in infectious materials is the nicest way I can think of to say it. She was doing her best to take care of herself, of course, and maintain her health. But she was caring, among other people, other workers, she was caring for old people who were coughing their lives out, people with tuberculosis, dysentery, and all other terrible kinds of maladies in the last closing days of their lives, aged people. This was right near the burning ghats of the Brahmaputra River, and Yeah, their corpses would soon be consumed by the purifying flames after they had died. So we got acquainted with her. We said, are you an employee here? Are you being paid? Oh, no, she said, I'm just volunteering. I said, well, how long have you been here? She said, well, almost 2 years, as I recall. I said, well, are you going to do this the rest of your life? She said, oh my, no, I hope not. And she said, but I said, well, how long are you going to do this? She said, well, I don't know, maybe another year or so. I thought maybe I'd come for 2 or 3 years. So I said, why are you doing this? And she said, well, for the sake of my own personal spiritual and moral development, I want to get a particular perspective on life that is not the Hollywood perspective, but is realistic. I wanted to understand and get perspective not only on life in general, but on my life. The more I understand of reality, of the reality of people's sufferings and hardships, the better I can understand my place in the world and be grateful for my blessings and so forth. Pat and I have never forgotten her. We were both tremendously impressed. And we found ourselves thinking, wow, every college student should have at least some kind of experience of total immersion into the Jericho Road, if you please. And so at the very least on our campus, we have the Good Samaritan reminding us something of what that's about in the famous statue. As rendered by Alan Collins here, the thought occurred to me when I put this picture in here this week in preparation for this, that the way Collins has lined this up, he's got the other two roads we've just looked at, right? The academic in his scholarly regalia, the path of the mind, but he's only observing. The cleric in his priestly vestments, in charge of the department of ritual, but this is not a ritual, and so he doesn't want anything to do with it. And so we have both Jnana Yoga, the Emmaus Road, and Bhakti Yoga, potentially the Damascus Road, but neither of them seems to be quite living up to the demands of the Jericho Road, which is what we see here. A person who is not qualified by profession or schooling, training or background, but is simply someone who is out of step, who is outcast in society. Collins was very deliberate in his choice of someone with African American features as representing the action and work of the Samaritan. A powerful sculpture. And if our students can't all go to Nepal or somewhere, maybe the center of our campus helps to bring the lesson home in some ways. Yeah. The Way of the Soul. Here's the fourth one. It doesn't have a name like Emmaus or Damascus or Jericho, because it doesn't have a formal story associated with it in the New Testament. And we also are puzzled what to make of this. Is it prayer? Is it meditation? It doesn't have to involve fancy yogic asanas, positions, or postures. Indeed, there are real differences of conception and practice in comparable phenomena between Christianity and Hinduism, among the other various world religions. Even so, this royal road, however defined, graces and guides the spiritual life of pilgrims along the way on any of these spiritual paths that we've looked at and across the faith traditions. However it's practiced by whomever, one of its central features is its integrative function. On one level, This refers to its ability to align body, mind, soul, spirit, and common shared directions. There's something holistic about it. How else can we know who we are? Precisely because of this integrative quality, we Westerners have trouble understanding it. Across the absolute gulf between humanity and divinity, we can experience prayer. Prayer as both listening and speaking, speaking and listening, too often more of the former than the latter, I might add. That's across the gulf, the vertical gulf between humanity and divinity, yeah? But there's another gulf, a different one, that's also addressed in this road. The alternate gulf is between our ordinary mundane self in its manifestation in our untamed minds and the overarching selfhood that we share with all of mankind. This is between humans and humans, in other words, huh? This practice in this road means transcending the selfishness that marks our illusory I self, that the Gita repeatedly admonishes us to get over. The Gita in its poems, its stanzas, again and again speaks of getting rid of the I self, getting past the illusion of the I self. I also chosen a couple of verses here from chapter 12. She or he who has let go of hatred, who treats all beings with kindness and compassion, who's always serene, unmoved by pain or pleasure, free of the I and mine, self-controlled, firm, patient, her whole mind focused on me. That's the one I love best. That's the one whose prayers bridge both the gulf between humans and divine, but between individual humans and humankind in general, the way of the soul. For this formidable task, then, mind and body need to be linked in specific, disciplined practices. And so this pathway then is different from the others. It can complement and enrich any of the previous three paths, yet for certain individuals, it emerges as their own most natural and primary spiritual style. It's never a substitute for life, rather it better enables life. And so we are, to sum up then, the way of the mind, the heart, the hand, epitomized in the New Testament by the Emmaus Road, the Damascus Road, the Jericho Road. The early Christians preserved these stories, not only as history, which they are, but also as paradigmatic types of religious experience. The ancient faith traditions converge then around the wisdom of the yoke, while the stories point the way. Two questions now to finish remain. The first question is, well, how do I know which one or combination of these is best suited to my own personal pilgrimage of faith? How do I choose? Typically, individuals are instinctively drawn to one or two of these spiritual modes. Some find natural fits with the categories of the analytical instruments used by professionals, counselors, pastors, therapists. The most common of these is the Myers-Briggs matrix. It is not always does not always meet with approval by practitioners. There are some limitations and some distortions, but its major contours have proven useful for tracking general spiritual patterns. And if you had a chance to look at the Spectrum article that we distributed ahead of time, I tried to interweave some of those Myers-Briggs categories with the spiritual pathways a little more explicitly than we can take time to do today. There is a simpler resource, but it's comparable to the Myers-Briggs. In fact, it's built on it, that you can administer to yourself. It's available online at the Kiersey Temperament Sorter. And there are a couple of websites there. This is being recorded. And it may be that if you want to recover those, you can bring them up in the coming week. You can go to this screen and find these if you like as well, and click on them. Or if you simply enter in your browser Keirsey temperament sorter, notice the spelling Keirsey, and it'll lead you to the websites. So there's that. And the Keirsey categories go like this. There's the way of the mind, rational, the way of the heart, guardian, basically, way of the hand, artisan, the way of the soul, the idealist. It's the middle two letters that basically govern these. That's all we'll take time for on that today, but just to give you some sense of that, you may find it helpful if you're still trying to identify what might be one or two helpful pathways in your own life. The second question, however, is the final one, and it has to do with our ultimate goals. In other words, is there an overarching, even an integrative outcome that beyond each of these pathways, beyond Damascus and Jericho, can be seen to characterize any spiritually mature person of any personality type? Is there a universal kind of transformation that builds upon the strengths that characterize any of these pilgrimages that we've considered? The Gita's answer lies in a particular refrain that we find throughout all of its chapters. Again and again, we keep bumping into expressions like the following, quoting now from the Gita: self-possessed, resolute, act without attachment to results, open to success or failure. This equanimity is yoga. Or again, the wise person lets go of all results, whether successful or not, and is focused on the action alone. Yoga is skill in action. Notice here that this props up again and again, repeatedly in the Gita. I've only chosen these two of many such instances. Without attachment to results, or again, let go of results, whether successful or not. What does this mean? What does this possibly mean? Well, on one level, what it means is simply acting with integrity, coming from within oneself, as we might say, quite apart from whether or not others respond appropriately in accord with our highest best intentions. That is indeed a valid, correct reading of such passages. My uncle, Harold Jones, was professor of mathematics, chair of the math department for most of his career at Andrews University. He spent most of his Sabbath afternoons writing letters on behalf of Amnesty International to corrupt and harsh governing rulers, autocrats around the world. He would get the addresses from Amnesty International and some suggestive wording, but he would craft these handwritten letters very carefully, spend the afternoon, Sabbath, writing them to one ruler after another in specific ways, saying, now you know better than what you're doing. You know that your own religious tradition is higher than the way you're behaving, and so forth. And you know, I remember one time saying to him, well, Uncle Harold, how do you know? Do you think this is really accomplishing much of anything? And he said, well, I have no way of knowing. And I don't doubt that certain letters that I write either will not be passed on by the underlings of these corrupt rulers, or if they are, they'll be disregarded and tossed into the trash. But he said some of them will be read and maybe will strike a note of morality into their lives, at least for a time. And he said to me, and that's that's all. I cannot be accountable for what others do with my letters. My job is to write them, well, and mail them, and let the chips fall where they may, so to speak. And so that was a matter of his own personal integrity. And there's a sense in which what we read here, letting go of all results, without attachment to results. I think my Uncle Harold had never read the Gita. He may never have even heard of it, but I think he understood this principle. On one level, that's the answer to this question. There is, however, a little more to notice. Quoting from the Gita again, you have a right to your actions, but never to your actions' fruits. Act then for the action's sake and do not be attached to inaction. Again, the wise person whose insight is firm, relinquishing the fruits of action, is freed from the bondage of rebirth and attains the place beyond sorrow. Here, notice the language shifts a little bit. You have a right to your actions, but you don't have a right to your actions' fruits. Or again, the person who is relinquishing the fruit. What does this mean, to relinquish the fruits of one's actions? That's a little different from the previous thought. In passages like this, we see a further issue at work beneath the surface. It turns out that the Gita is thinking not only of others' responses to good influence, it is also thinking about, self-centered actions done for the purpose of making observers think more highly of us ourselves. Wow. And it's in this sense that Gandhi wrote that renunciation of the fruits of action is the center around which the Gita is woven. It's the central sun around which devotion and knowledge, here we are, these pathways, and the rest all revolve like planets. Beatrice Brutto gets this when she writes in regarding the way of the hand that whatever our work is, it can lead us to the highest realization if we accept it as a religious duty and perform it as worship. We are always to give our best unselfishly, doing it as well as we can. But get this, without any expectation of or desire for or regard or praise or gratitude. Isn't that interesting? She got it. Again, Stephen Mitchell picks up and broadens this application. And as he writes, just as the essence of Judaism is love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, as Jesus once reminded a sympathetic scribe, the essence of Hinduism is let go. He says these two statements are in fact the same truth. Love God, love your neighbor, without trying to manipulate him or use him as an occasion for enhancing your own status in the eyes of others. Yeah? Act out of love and let go. The statements are the beginning and the end of all spiritual practice. Isn't that interesting? In sum, if other-centeredness means being focused on others with an intention of exerting our will, however benignly, upon them, the Gita would call upon us to be self-centered, precisely out of respect for others. On the other hand, flipping it over, being self-centered here means acting from out of your own integrity and convictions without trying to lay your trip on other people. But if self-centeredness then means being focused on the impression we can make on other people about us, then the Gita admonishes us to get over ourselves and become genuinely othered-centered. Right there is in the interplay of those two ideas is the ultimate message and meaning of the Bhagavad Gita. With these perspectives in place now, and this is our final screen, we are now in a position to return to David Brooks, who concludes his essay by helping us to shift our focus, shift from the individual level, as we've mostly been looking at in these various spiritual pathways today, to broader societal implications. Moral formation is best when it's humble. There, you've got it. Same message, right? It means giving people the skills and habits that will help them be considerate to others in the complex situations of life. It means helping people behave in ways that make other people feel included, seen, respected. And then he adds, but that's very different from how we treat people now in our country, in ways that make them feel sad and lonely and make them grow unkind. And so, whether our personal pilgrimage takes us on the way of the mind or the heart, the hand or the soul, we learn from the Gita and the Gospels, both, that true advancement toward the hereafter bears implications for the here and now. And in that way, we benefit one another along the way. Thank you for your patience with that overlong presentation. I know we need to talk a little, so we'll take a chance to do that as we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. This was a wonderful presentation. We're going to take a little break for both you and us. And as we discussed previously, we're going to take 10 minutes. So we will come back at 11:52. And welcome back. It is now time for our discussion. John, I have to say this was one of the most beautiful presentations I have heard about the paths or yogas. Thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your time and your knowledge and your wisdom that you shared with us. When you look at your life,
Thank you. Everyone was very patient with long, and everyone was patient with my voice, which seems to be acting worse than usual this morning. But anyway, thanks.
No patience required. But when you look at your life, do you see that these paths are equally represented in all parts of your life, throughout your life, but in different forms? Or do you see that certain times in our lives are more contemplative, other are more active, and so on and so on?
That is a really insightful and interesting question, isn't it? Yes, I think, probably, well, I think that always it's a combination of our DNA and our professions, and how we interweave those together. I mean, and the thing is, I sometimes have students when I talk about these, and I give them the Kiersey temperament sorter as an assignment to learn about themselves. There's always one or two students who say, "Oh, well, I'm just equally in all of them," which is a facile and lazy answer, and it also means such a student doesn't know himself or herself very well anyway. Nobody is equal um, in the distribution of their aptitudes among these pathways. And in fact, for that matter, the Gita mentions mentions in passing 2 or 3 other pathways that we could add to these 4. So, yeah, in my case, yeah, it's a fair question. I probably have a natural inclination, I think, toward bhakti yoga, the experience of the divine, and probably backed up with with the yoga of meditation as well. But the fact of the matter is that my own life circumstances have actually pulled me in the other direction, particularly in the way, obviously, as an academic of knowledge. And I hope I've tried to develop it toward wisdom a little bit as well. But that I think has not been part of my natural DNA. It was more a result of my circumstances in life, I think, which is, I guess, a lesson to us all that we can shape these pathways in one way or another. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm going to give it now to Monty, who is going to lead us in our discussion. Thank you, Monty.
Thank you, Simona. I have just one hand up so far, and that's Stephen's, and I'll be watching for others. Stephen.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this presentation. Very informative and comprehensive. I will comment about the Myers-Briggs. As a clinician, I'm sort of in the use of that instrument.
Yeah.
I have used it for many, many years. And it's very important to understand what that instrument is really designed to do. And it's really designed to help us understand our preferences.
Yes.
Each of us are gifted differently. That's a really important understanding. Then that in those gifts, we are drawn to certain preferences in terms of our orientation, in terms of how we process, how we approach the world, how we process information, and how we act on information. And what the other piece of that is when we understand those preferences, it's also important to understand then what it is we can do to create more balance.
Yeah.
And what behaviors then we can employ to kind of balance our own preferences against what works best in the world. Because and so if you approach it that way, it really can be very, very useful. And so I just offer that as an observation. But it's fascinating. The four ways that you talk about are really intriguing, and I find that I've used all of those at one point or another, and I find that the whole residual or the whole impetus of action is really critical.
Yeah.
I see that clinically. Because action, in point of fact, changes brain chemistry for the better. And so when we are inactive, there is the opportunity for an increase in anxiety and depression because those maladies feed on inactivity. Action is the most natural antidote to either of those that we have control over. So it's all, what we confront in these four is that we look for integration because we are an integrated system, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And so I greatly appreciate this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. You can help us unpack the implications and think about that. It's intriguing to me as I listen to you on two or three levels. One is that, first of all, you have found, obviously, some genuine benefit and help with the Myers-Briggs structure. I'm very aware that not all practitioners are equally positive toward it, but I'm glad to hear that, and I think it validates something for purposes of broad painting with a broad paintbrush like this anyway. I'm also intrigued with the idea of not only using these aptitudes or predilections, if we may call them, to determine something of ourselves, but also to compensate for flat spots in ourselves. It's a knife in some ways that cuts both directions, it seems to me, as I listen to you. Maybe you said what you want to say about that, but
Yeah, I fully agree. And when we understand those preferences and then what the strengths are, and one of the things I point out, in my clinical practice, any strength taken to excess becomes a weakness.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, that needed saying. I'm glad that you got that in. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I see Bob Ford has his hand up. I'm gonna jump in just a moment right on this topic. John, can you help me understand in the text, is this an idea of paths? When I think of paths, it's like we often talk about choosing a path. Is the idea that these are different paths that different people will have, or is there the concept of these are flavors of path within the individual? I'm just curious what the
yeah, Monty, good question.
original is.
I think the answer is yes and yes, sort of. We do all have our yes, as Stephen has just reminded us, we all have our preferences. We all have our natural instinctive strengths, I suppose, is the way to speak of it. But nobody is devoid on with regard to any one. We all have elements of all potentials within ourselves. Am I saying that correctly, Stephen?
Yes, that's absolutely the case. It's a matter of dimension.
Yeah, that's right. And of dimension, and then of course of reinforcement and habituation, I suppose too, right? Yeah.
I would agree. Yeah.
And so spiritually valid experiences, I think what your question is leading us to think about, Moni, is that yes, there is validity for everyone in every one of the paths. There's potential there, and it just may be that we lend ourselves more readily to one than to another, but part of the richness of life is the opportunities it gives us to grow in multifaceted ways.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, does that help a little? Yeah.
And you experience, is that what you experience Krishna have as calling followers to? Is the balance of those? Or maybe even not a balance, but just along the same time, you might have preferences, but these are aspects of our lives we need to be aware of.
Yes, I think that's well said. Yes, the cognitive strength of the pathway, the first pathway, has come to me, but only in certain forms. I've had thrust upon me cognitive areas of responsibility that I hardly would welcome. But over the years, again and again, it's been more. My love of teaching has been both complicated and complemented by all kinds of administrative responsibilities, which I take it as an opportunity to grow through the nether path, so to speak, that I really would just as soon not have, but nonetheless has repeatedly come my way, and so I guess there's a lesson in all of that somewhere. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your addressing that. Bob, we're going to go to you, and then I see Simona's got her hand up again.
Yes, thank you very much, John. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. It seems to me you're saying that a balance or that we're all made up of these four paths, these four elements. This is that it makes who we are. And so I wanted to ask about the concept of belonging and identity. How there's identity individually, and who we are as a person, and maybe different times in our lives. But what about identity collectively? Now, each of these religious traditions, in a sense, create an identity to say, I'm a true Muslim, I'm a true Christian, I'm a true, Hindu. How do we define that? And how do we avoid the danger that I think happens if we begin to say my identity is better than your identity? And isn't that kind of the problem of some of these, of how some of these have been interpreted, and what leads us down that kind of heresy, if I might call it?
That's really an interesting question, isn't it, Bob? The fact of the matter is, it starts with the fact that religious traditions have personalities, don't they? I mean, there is such thing as there's nothing pejorative about this, but there is such thing as a kind of a Catholic personality, Jehovah's Witness personality, a Muslim personality, at least in popular thought anyway.
Right.
And therefore, I can only assume there's such a thing as an Adventist personality in a certain way. And I don't know which is chicken and which is egg here. I don't know whether certain types of religious structures and systems of thought attract certain kinds of people, or if that's self-reinforcing, or how that works. I don't know. That's the first thing to say. But it does seem to me that every religion in the world is always and only one generation away from extinction. And the way religions go on, to some degree, it depends on a number of important key issues, but to some degree, one is the ability to meet the needs of people who bring different conceptions, experiential types, predilections for certain pathways to the table. And if a particular religion or church or faith tradition fails to meet all four, let us say, we'll say four for the moment, probably 64 would be closer to it, but the needs of their members or potential members, they will increasingly narrow the vision and perhaps lose members for that matter. I think that, and here I'm running beyond your question a bit, I think, but I think that what that challenges us each to do is to deliberately work to broaden within our own faith tradition. If we find something lacking or missing, I think this is less an invitation to leave than it is to enrich my Adventism, let us say, in directions where it may not have the strength that some other church or world religion may have. Because ultimately it turns out that that the secret on all of these roads is that the way of growth is by contribution. And I do believe, this is perhaps naive on my part, But I do believe that mature, well-ripened faith traditions have the potential to broaden and diversify and to incorporate people who walk perhaps unconsciously faith ways that they may not have had before or may not have had as much. So I think it's a call to diversity, not only on the individual level, but on the corporate level as well. I don't know, does that help a little?
No, it does. It kind of reminds me, in a way, historically, we look back at the rise of the Millerite movement or others, the so-called Great Awakening.
Yes.
In a sense, that was a renewing of what had, if I hear what you're saying, it was a call to renewal and change and adapting to that time. Just like maybe today we have to do that as well. And that's hard for institutional structures which get ossified. I think maybe that's the challenge of our time.
It is. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, thank you. Okay, I am going to go to Anastasia for gender balance and first question, and then to Peter for his first question, and then to Simona. So Anastasia, welcome.
Thank you so very much, John. Again, I think humbly, the best Christian apologetics is to do what you did, which is to see the universal truths. And instead of the fear that especially Protestantism had against humanism, thinking that all, and yes, they had a point about the I, the emphasis of that. But nevertheless, as Sophocles, one of our people in the 5th century BC, in his tragedy Oedipus and others, pointed that he made fun of the Olympian gods in a subtle way, sometimes not so subtle, because they were going to throw him in jail like they did for Socrates. When he said, gods act like men and men act like gods. That the universal truths to test who is God and who is not. We saw it in Christ. It was these universal truths that transcend cultures and sects and race and everything, because they work and for what it is. And the great, that helped me very much in accepting and preparing me for Christ, and lectures like yours, to see God is bigger than being Greek, Orthodox, Catholic, etc. It is the truth. He is the truth. He is love. And these ways point us to him. And I want to thank you very much for it.
Oh, thank you for helping us think together. Yeah, I think Sophocles got a laugh when he said that in his, but he had a point, didn't he?
All right, thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much, John, for your very interesting presentation and challenging.
Thank you, Peter, for sitting through it so patiently.
I hope that I'll not repeat something that my friends were saying before me, because I have the internet interrupted for a while and I don't know what they said. But I like to say that I like very much the way you started your presentation with that article in Atlantic, that it's looking at the situation that we are experiencing these days in America. And making a connection, I mean, the recommendation in this article that the keyword morality is missing. And the suggestions that the author of the article is making to introduce some questions that will be a kind of remedy for this situation that it's very bad in America today. And I was very much impressed by the fact that there is a similarity of paths in connecting with the divine, spiritual paths that existed in Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy and the Judeo-Christian philosophy. They sometimes go, we can say, in parallel. And what this makes me to believe that the spiritual truth was the preoccupation for this was, it didn't start with Jesus, was much older, that the people feel to search for the truth and for this spiritual connection with the divine. But this connection with the divine in the same time is not only connection with the divine, but also is bringing us, is affecting our relationship with ourselves, between us.
Yes, yes.
And the question that I have is that I read very carefully your article in Spectrum, and I have noticed that you were recommending, mentioning Sandra, Myers-Briggs and others that you're quoting, with different ways in like pathways reaching the divine, connecting with the divine.
Yeah.
Like candles and prayer and dance and music and prayer I mentioned, yeah, and many others. And I was curious to know which one of these would you recommend for us?
Interesting. Yeah, no, but yeah, actually, Peter, no one has asked that question, and I'm glad that you're here that you could do it. Yes. I think the first quick little remark to make is that I was lumping them all together in that paragraph. You know, I was not at that point. I was just talking about ritual in general as a category, and yeah, I just wanted to quickly say, yeah, here we are. Candles, I'm quoting here at the moment from Sandra Hirsch. Candles, incense, music, devotions, pictures aid a person's spiritual practice. And then I add my own, I keep the list going. Mantra, prayer, dance and chant, gesture and posture, costume and symbol, myth and parable, rite and ceremony, gongs and chimes, the smells and bells of the sacred, I called it.
Yeah.
I was not setting up any particular choice among those. What I really was wanting to do in the second pathway there was to say, okay, it starts with ritual many times. I don't care what ritual, prayer, music, chimes, incense, I don't know, whatever. But for the moment, let's just say ritual, ceremony. But that people can grow beyond that, even within the bhakti yoga pathway, still within bhakti yoga, to deeper levels of experience with the divine. Because I acknowledge that ritual alone doesn't get us as far as we can go. I say the following: at their best, these resources can bring great richness of meaning into our encounters with the holy, but at less than their best, they can become mechanical, even magical, repetitious, and so forth. And I wanted to acknowledge that and make that clear. So I think finally it's a question of yes, Mother Teresa. I think she started with rituals, but she grew through those into ministering, even as she was ritualizing, as if she was washing Jesus' face when she was washing the face of these other people, it carried her forward. So I guess what I want to say is that ritual has power, even positive power. But I think that bhakti yoga really should deepen into deeper love as it ripens and matures in our lives. Now, you invited me to make a difference and sort out among those different ones, but for purposes of that essay, I think I was just putting them all together. That may not help. I don't know, that may not be where you wanted me to go with that, but yeah.
But you don't have any recommendation in particular for what do you think will be the strongest one?
Prayer,
Prayer.
yes. But it's in that point, prayer becomes more than a ritual. It remains a ritual, but it also deepens beyond ritual.
Because reading the article, an example came to my mind. I saw an Islamic sect, dervish,
Yes.
spinning around, spinning and spinning and spinning until they get dizzy, they lost their consciousness, and they think that they reach the connection with the divine.
Well, there are many ways of doing that, I guess.
Right.
We all know that when you spin around enough, the blood goes from the brain out to the extremities. But at the same time, how else? I mean, I think this is an altered state of consciousness, and they're trying to take advantage of it in some way, feeling they've been in touch with the divine.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Anastasia, did you have a comment related to that in particular?
Yes, I want to say we have to be careful not to criticize when we say people think they reach something, especially for people that have never danced. From my culture, also for myself, it's something in certain dancing that when you do it, you rid yourself of the I. And there's almost there is, for some of us that have done it, a metaphysical connection. Also, many people that have not done contemplation, or they haven't been in something, maybe Catholic to the Eastern, especially the monastic experience, where, of course, there's always this misuse. When ritual is there to remind us of history, for memory, it's like when we read at the minimum the metaphors in a beautiful story, the metaphors, and also some of those rituals, like for instance, the icons, the candles, etc., from the Old Testament in a particular tradition. That is a school that is holistic in that tells you the story, and at the same time, because of the incense and the candles, the metaphors, with a story and with a quietness. We Protestants sometimes, when I'm a Protestant, don't know how to pray in that particular way.
Yeah.
Be quiet. One of the hardest things as a child, because I like to talk, is for my parents to put me in a corner to tell me, now you have to be quiet. And then in the quietness, to have the music, to have the stories, to have the visual, to have all the senses like we do in a Greek Orthodox church, those senses that can help you, not hinder you, unless they become as useless magic or this or that. To forget your surroundings, to let your spirit and your soul lift up. As the Old Testament says in the Psalms, let my prayer be like an incense unto you. So when those metaphors work together with the contemplation of the Almighty, who are we to say that the sophists in that rounding around don't glimpse or have an experience with God? So let's be careful.
Thank you, Anastasia.
All right, thank you. Simona.
I'm kind of just adding to this. I think that different people find meaning in different things.
For sure.
You know, for someone who is more on the bhakti road, you know, there is a beauty in acquiring knowledge and wisdom, and they may see God in reading a book, while a person who is more contemplative, you know, they may see it in prayer or meditation of some kind, or, you know, so we are all different. We find our understanding of God, our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of the world in different ways. And all these experiences are equally valuable, because if an experience brings us closer to the power of becoming more like God, then it doesn't matter how you did it.
Yeah.
You know, in this particular sense, I think that the end justifies the means, provided nobody got hurt. Okay, so it's a in our different ways, in our differences, this is the whole tapestry of our beliefs and of our society, of our churches, of you know, looking around ourselves and within ourselves. All these things are equally important and necessary. And I think that it is important for us to recognize that we need each other to be different, to have these differences, to approach these things differently, because we enrich each other by seeing things from a different point of view.
Yeah, that's important. Followed by what you also said a paragraph or two back there, Simona, that ultimately, and this emerged in my preparation for today, but it was not in my article. Is there something beyond all four of these experiences to which they point? You know, that and it seemed to me that if I read either the New Testament or the Gita, I'm pointed to finally moving beyond my self-centeredness and my prescriptiveness for others. There is a growth there. It doesn't matter which pathway I'm walking, finally, that simply calls us to a higher level. And when the Gita speaks of moving beyond our attachment, our attachment to the fruits of our actions, I think it's trying to tell us something, awaken us to something, to that higher maturation. And it is a maturation that allows me to hear again the voice of Jesus, who says, love your neighbor. And it seems to me to be part of the same message. If I love my neighbor, I am neither trying to control him or tell him what to do, nor am I using him to try to get some kind of fame or approval for myself. Beyond that, you know. And by the way, just while we're at it, as long as we're spinning this, I'll just go on and add, Lao Tzu basically said in chapter 9 of the Tao Te Ching, he says, whatever work needs to be done, do it. And then step away from it, step back from it, turn it loose. Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
Isn't that the same as Jesus saying, you just throw the seed, you don't worry where it falls, right?
Yeah, right. I think there's some kind of a profound spiritual insight there that's only beginning to get a hold of my life, beyond what I realized for years, and I hear that voice of Jesus, and I hear the voice of the Buddha, who says, the self really is an illusion. Finally, it's just a way of relativizing the self so that I don't get hung up within myself in some way. I see their other hand, so I will not blather on about this, but you get the idea. Yeah,
I just wanted to very quickly to say, I don't think this world lacks morality as much as it lacks compassion. I think that, you know, we have lots of rules, you know, how to and which way and who and whatever. but maybe a little bit more compassion, a little bit more understanding for each other, a little bit more acceptance. And finally, I'm reminded of what Stephen said some time ago about the difference between being a believer and being a disciple. And I hope that he's going to repeat this on tape, because that was in our after session. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay. I have a number of people in the queue. I have Robert, then Peter, and Stephen. So Robert.
Just very, very quickly on that last point.
Yeah.
When you talked about David Brooks and his trying to assess the problem that we as a culture are in right now, isn't, whether we're mean or whether we're sad, that in a sense is saying we're missing the whole point of what it means to be approaching God, which means we're supposed to do good without expecting a result. We're supposed to do, I think that's another way of saying what you are talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, meanness and sadness are results of prescriptions or false expectations of others.
Right.
And as long as you can't control others, and you think you need to, you're going to be either mean, sad, or both. Right? So,
yeah, absolutely. And that's a very bad combination for a healthy society or a healthy person. Yeah.
It is. That's right.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think Brooks is onto something. By the way, he's got a book coming out that expands what he says in this article. I'm looking forward to seeing his book.
Okay, Peter.
Yeah. I guess you need to unmute, Peter.
In your article, when you mentioned the fourth spiritual path, the path of the soul, you also call it the royal path, if I understood, pathway, if I understood correctly. And in our previous discussion, you mentioned the recommendation that the prayer is the most important. What about the meditation? Would you care to comment a little bit? Because in our Christian experience, we are using also meditation. Do you see something positive and negative in it, doing in a wrong way? Or can you comment a little bit on this?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. That is an important question. There is much to say, but it may be that multiplying words is not the helpful way to talk about meditation. Let me begin from within the Christian standpoint. When Jesus was praying all night long, I am not sure that he was spending all of the time talking to his Father. I suppose he was talking with his Father. Talking with is different from talking to. Talking with includes times of listening. Listening. Now, once that is part of the pathway, we face the question of how to name it. Is it still prayer, or has it become meditation? I will certainly concur that Christian meditation, and let us say Buddhist vipassana meditation, insight meditation, are two different activities. They do have in common, however, the act of learning, perceiving, deepening. And if that's called prayer, it's okay with me. And if it's called meditation, it's still okay with me. I don't know if that helps. There's much more we could say on it, but yeah.
Yeah.
What about meditation in the Indian sense? I mean, Buddhist sense?
Yeah. Okay, if we want to prolong the conversation, yes, I would say there are two gaps to be bridged. And I tried to have something of that in one of the slides, I think. There is the gap between us and God. There is also the gap between my selfish personhood and my shared humanity with the rest of humankind. It, I think that Buddhist meditation has less to do with my individuality and more to do with my corporate participation in humanity as a whole. The Buddha would say, the self is an illusion. Meditate to get past that illusion. And I'm not sure that that contradicts Christianity. I think it's simply kind of intersects Christianity, the vertical intersected by the horizontal in some way. That's my mental image. It does not mean, as it's often misinterpreted and misunderstood by Christians, to mean some kind of self-reliance. Indeed, the self is the great enemy in Buddhist meditation. We must gain the mastery over that illusion. I'm not sure if that helps or not, but it may be occasion for another conversation on another time when we, by the way, David has asked me to think about talking about each of these great faith traditions along the way. So we may, I mean, I'm not selling this and I'm not asking to do it, but if David persecutes me long enough, I may agree to do something on Islam and something on Judaism and something on Buddhism or whatever. Yeah. I will admit, though, that it's hard to come up with terms, with names. We're at the intersections, at the borders between these different spiritual practices.
Okay, thank you.
That will be
John.
that will be very interesting. And quickly, what I was very much interested is the problem of losing the control of the mind, the danger of losing control of the mind.
Yeah. Well, that is a real issue and one to be talked about. And yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, I think Spirit of Prophecy helps us there.
Okay, let's go to Stephen.
Thank you. I think one of the important distinctions that I always kind of fall back to is to recognize that when we're discussing these pathways, we recognize them as just that.
Yeah.
They're pathways.
Yeah.
They are not the destination. And what we get all too frequently in whatever practices we engage in, we get wrapped around our axles in becoming so enmeshed in the practice of the pathway that we forget that it's designed to lead us to something beyond itself. And I'm reminded of the quote by Alan Watts, who was a very well-known Western philosopher who had a great Eastern orientation. And he said, and I use this as the analogy when we're talking about pathways, he said, I point to the moon and people look at my finger.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And that's what happens, is that these pathways are designed to get us beyond themselves and to something beyond that, to the eternal. And we get wrapped up in looking and getting engaged in the pathway itself. And as a result, it becomes counterproductive.
Yes.
So we have to be balanced in knowing that these are avenues, literally, that are designed to take us to another place, if you will, in terms of a closer relationship to our Creator.
Yes.
So I'm just constantly aware of that. There was earlier, is there one that you would recommend? I think everybody's drawn to a different pathway for different reasons, for different predilections, different preferences. I don't find any one in them themselves to be
innate.
on a hierarchical scale better than the other.
Supreme, yeah.
But just in terms of what it is that we are drawn to and what we find that takes us where we need to go.
Yeah. Well, one of the lessons I've learned from Alan Watts is that he was never frozen. I'm not sure I always understand the dance he was dancing, but he was never hung up and never afraid. He was a gutsy character, and there's a lesson in that for us all, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I love his quote: "Once you get the message, you hang up the phone."
Hang up the phone. Yes.
And Stephen, could you please repeat for the benefit of those who didn't hear the distinction between believer and disciple? I think it kind of adds to this discussion.
I think, believing becomes easy. Believing is the easy part.
Yeah.
That's a cognitive function. Just being a disciple means practicing the discipline that goes with that. And Christ encouraged his disciples, and he called them that because they were living out in the way they conducted themselves on a daily basis that which he engendered, and that's what the example he set. And so I find that all of us are disciples of different things, and I find it fascinating. And I always reflect on how do we spend our time, and in a variety of ways. We are disciples of physical well-being, we're disciples of TV shows, we're disciples of all kinds of things. And so the discipleship in terms of our spiritual growth is that what are those practices that we do on a constant basis that exemplify and are part of what Jesus presented to us. And it is that living, that acting, that action. And I'm always reminded that when Christ healed people, he always gave them an action step. He just didn't heal them, but he said, get up and walk, do this, do that, something that followed the healing. In the Orthodox tradition, we talk about their salvation and then their sanctification. Sanctification is what it is you do after salvation. That is those practices that you work on in terms of your daily life that lead you closer to what God intended you to be. So that's the distinction I make. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, everybody. And thank you, John, for your presentation and your responses to the many questions.
So I'd like to say thank you to the whole group, both for your patience and thoughtful questions, which have helped me to reflect and grow with you this morning. I appreciate this.
Simona, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you especially, John, for giving us the impetus to discuss these important questions. As I was thinking about, our closing today, I ran into a poem that is called Risk, written by William Arthur Ward. To laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is to risk appearing sentimental. To reach out to another is to risk involvement. To expose feelings is to risk exposing your true self. To place your ideas and dreams before a crowd is to risk their loss. To love is to risk not being loved in return. To hope is to risk despair. To try is to risk failure. But risks must be taken because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. He may avoid suffering and sorrow, but he cannot learn, feel, change, grow, or live. Changed by his servitude, he is a slave who has forfeited all freedom. Only a person who risks is free. The pessimist complains about the wind. The optimist expects it to change, and the realist adjusts the sails. Our blessing for today. God's peace be known deep within your soul when anxiety and fear assail you, when daily life becomes a burden that is difficult to carry. God's peace be known and felt as those arms reach out to hold you. God's peace be known and heard in words of comfort and release. God's peace be known. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.